Hello, my name is Kristen Alonso, and I will be performing an experiment on how different sugars affect yeast fermentation. How I came up with it. I wanted the experiment to be something I can actually perform and afford, so I researched up on substances that wouldn't be completely out of my reach, either budget or friendly-wise, and I stumbled across yeast. It's very much affordable and obtainable, so I realized that I'd be able to find the time to do the experiment in between my job and school on the weekends. What is yeast fermentation? Yeast fermentation happens when the yeast is exposed to sugar. The yeast uses the sugar to obtain energy to produce both ethanol and carbon dioxide. This process is used to produce various types of alcohol that we know, such as beer and wine. What I hope to learn. I want to see how different types of sugars have an effect on yeast fermentation by testing the rate of CO2 production that fructose, glucose, and sucrose may produce. I will be using sugars that fall into these respective types, such as raw organic honey, coconut water, granulated sugar, etc. In this, I hope to see which may be the most effective in alcohol production. Hypothesis. I believe that the raw sugar cane sugar will perform the best out of the initial substrates when compared to sugars like brown sugar or granulated sugar. Raw cane sugar is a lot less processed and is derived from sugar cane rather than sugar beets like that of granulated sugar. It is also a sucrose sugar, which is a lot more abundant and commonly used. The experiment. The materials I used for this experiment include 16-ounce bottles, balloons, 6 grams of yeast per bottle, measuring tape, different sugars such as granulated sugar, brown sugar, raw sugar cane sugar, organic coconut water, and organic honey. Water will be used for both the fermentation process and as my control. For this experiment, as I stated, I used 6 different sugars as my substrate. The sugars included raw organic honey represented by a yellow balloon, organic coconut water represented by a green balloon, brown sugar represented by a red balloon, granulated sugar represented by a blue balloon, raw sugar cane sugar represented by an orange balloon, and water was used for my control represented with the white balloon. I began pouring in 2 teaspoons of active dry yeast into each 16-ounce bottle. From there, I added 1 tablespoon of each substrate into its respective bottle. And finally, I then added in 8 ounces of warm water. Once the yeast sugar mixture was placed in the bottle, I then mixed the contents gently before covering the bottle's opening with a latex balloon. From there, I let the bottles rest for 1 hour as I let the yeast fermentation take place, making sure to check in about every 15 minutes. The top photos are taken 15 minutes into the fermentation process, while the bottom was taken 30 minutes into the fermentation process. These photos are also showing how big the balloons have grown with the CO2 production. The top photos were taken at the 45-minute mark, while the bottom was taken at the 60-minute mark. After this initial test, I then repeated this process 4 times to gather my data of each sugar's balloon circumference. The results. After gathering the data consisting of each balloon circumference, after each trial, I then made an Excel spreadsheet. From there, I was able to make a table calculating both the average or mean of the balloon circumference and the standard deviation of it as well. With the final results calculated, I found that honey had the greatest amount of CO2 production with an average circumference of 13.32 inches. From there, the average circumference measurements decreased from brown sugar at 13.05 inches, granulated sugar at 13.01 inches, raw sugar cane sugar at 12.5 inches, organic coconut water at 5.78 inches, and water at 0 inches. Here, with the data that was collected, I was able to make a bar graph showing the average of each substrate CO2 production, as well as having error bars for each bar graph depicted. The error bars were created by using the standard deviation that was calculated from the substrate's respective measurements, allowing us to see that no significant difference was present between the substrates honey, brown sugar, granulated sugar, and raw sugar cane sugar. What did show a significant difference was the organic coconut water and the control. The coconut water, although producing some amount of CO2, did not produce as much as those that had higher sugar levels, while the control had no CO2 production or evidence that the fermentation process even took place. What does it mean? From this experiment, I concluded that raw organic honey was the best substrate to use for the yeast fermentation process of alcohol production. It produced the most amount of carbon dioxide and was also a lot easier to work with than that of its solid and granulated counterparts. It dissolved and blended easier with the yeast and warm water mixture. This in turn revealed that a fructose sugar outperformed both the glucose and sucrose sugars. Even so, it did not show an abundant amount of difference when compared to those same sugars. Hypothesis result. My hypothesis in this instance was false. I had originally stated and believed that the raw sugar cane sugar would perform the best, but I was disproved. Not only did it not perform the best, but it was also a lot harder to dissolve into the yeast warm water mixture, as the sugar granules were a lot larger when compared to the others. In the end, the best type of sugar for alcohol production proved to be fructose, followed by sucrose, and then glucose. How did it go? Initially, with my first run of the experiment, I had used a tablespoon of yeast as well as 3 tablespoons of each substrate. With that happening, the fermentation and CO2 levels were high, but the yeast substrate and warm water mixture was entering the balloon, so I did have to adjust my yeast and sugar levels for the experiment and start again from scratch. But overall, I believe that the experiment went well. Even though the results I was expecting did not happen, I think that they still allowed me to see that even things with the smallest amount of sugar levels are able to produce some sort of yeast fermentation. It also allowed me to see that there are an abundance of ways that alcohol production can take place and are in no way limited. How can I better the experiment? Allowing the fermentation process to take place a bit longer may help the experiment. By doing so, it would show how the differing sugars perform over an extended period of time rather than in the initial hour. Another thing would be the temperature. Testing the sugars at different temperatures could show dramatically different results among the sugars.